So you talked about investor certainty, moons aligning. If you had your way, what's on your shopping list for sort of policy certainty for the next decade? What do you want to see?
I think the first point is what we're looking for now, I think, is policy certainty long beyond the next decade. So I think what we know is investments in energy infrastructure have a 15, 20, 30-year life. And I think now is the time, I think, to provide the sort of policy environment for many decades to come. I guess, it won't come as any surprise that a clean energy target is clearly what we're looking for. We know the chief scientists put forward 50 recommendations. We know 49 of them have now been adopted and are moving into implementation, and that's fantastic to see. There's a lot of devil in the detail around those recommendations. Many of them are long overdue, but they're here now, and I think it's time to get on with them. The final recommendation really is the most crucial one. You can reform the energy market, you can have a 21st century energy system, but unless you've got the investment climate for those new investments, then it's all a little bit academic. And I think we're at a moment in time where we're starting to see the consequences of underinvestment in the energy sector. I mentioned there's $8 billion of investment underway right now, unprecedented levels of private investment in the energy system, but this is after many years of very slow investment. And so what we need now is to continue that level of investment for many, many years to come. And a clean energy target is clearly the chief scientist's recommendation. It's proven to work in many ways. We understand it as an industry. I think ultimately now's the time to put it in place to obviously ensure we're making the new investments to secure energy supply long into the future, but also fundamentally to bring more supply into the market to drive down wholesale prices from the very high levels that they're at the moment.
On your cost comparison graph that you put up earlier, you had there some costs associated with firming wind and solar. Can you dig into that a little bit for us? Because I think that's often a criticism or a concern around high penetration of renewables is this ability to have the power there when and where you need it. So what does that sort of look like from the CEC's perspective?
We all know that the general public want us to shift towards renewable energy. That's long been clear, but it came with two conditions. One was around cost, and I think the other charts that I showed there showed the cost reductions we've seen and the fact that ultimately renewable energy is now the lowest cost new form of generation. But the other one is about ensuring that the lights stay on. And if there was a silver lining from the events in South Australia last year, it was a much greater attention to the way in which the energy system's managed and indeed the different characteristics of different forms of energy. We know we've taken for granted a lot of the fossil fuel generation and the services they provide to the energy system for a long time. I think it's fair to say we haven't done a great job of refining the energy market, ensuring there's price signals in the energy market for those different services, and whether that's fast frequency response, whether it's inertia, whatever it might be. And so I think what we're seeing now is a period where firstly we're looking at how can these new technologies provide some of those sorts of services. So single axis tracking on a large scale solar farm, what does that deliver us? There's pilots that ARENA are supporting around synthetic inertia of wind. We know energy storage and indeed rooftop solar inverters have got extraordinary capability that can help support the system. So I think we're in a period where we're seeing ways in which we can unlock all of these different technologies, ways in which they will all come together. So rather than just building a wind farm here, you might be building a wind farm with some large-scale solar and indeed with some storage on site. So all of these things together, I think, deliver us a portfolio of different solutions and services to the system. And I think, going to your original question, ultimately I think what we're seeing is that they can be delivered at quite low cost. Yeah. So there is a cost associated with the variability of renewables. I don't think we should ignore that. But actually, even with the technologies and solutions we've got at our disposal today, that's a low cost. Right. Before you start to look at things like pumped hydro and the way in which they might be developed to also contribute to the system and help to manage that variability.
Yeah, great. We've got a few new questions coming through, so thank you to the audience. I think you talked a little bit about encouraging private investment in renewables, but maybe just touching on storage. Obviously, it's a pretty hot topic. Do you think we need specific incentives there to bring storage to the market, or it's the sort of thing that will just be encouraged by the very nature of this transition that's happening and the need for it to be there to complement renewables?
Yes, so I think it's clear that storage comes with it a whole range of services for the energy market and the system, much more than just dumping power into the system at a particular moment in time, albeit that has value as well. I think the challenge we've got is that the market framework doesn't necessarily recognise or value all of those different services that it can provide. And therefore, I guess the short answer to the question is, if we reform the market, if we're able to allow investors to realise the value of all of those different services that they can be providing into the system, given where costs have moved to, then we think there's a lot of opportunity for storage to be highly cost competitive without the need for large subsidies. Now, we don't yet have that market, and I think the sort of programs that ARENA are supporting, indeed governments like South Australia, Victoria, Queensland and elsewhere, I think are really important at this moment in time to help demonstrate the technology, to help identify the barriers, to help work them through, start to build scale. And I think if we do that alongside of reform the energy market, expose those price signals, then I think we're going to see battery technology take off at a great rate of knots around the country.
Great, really exciting. We've got a couple, please. We've got a couple of minutes to go. Kane, solar PV and wind seem to be sorted. What is the next technology on the horizon? Pumped hydro, solar thermal, wave power, other?
I've been in this industry long enough to know you're a brave fool to try and pick which of those. I mean, I think the reality is pound for pound cost basis, it's solar and wind, and they're in I think a ferocious competition, competing with each other, and long may that competition continue. But I think again, as we're looking for other systems and services into the energy market, I think some of these other technologies will play a role. Yep. There's clearly opportunities, there's clearly parts of the country from a renewable resource perspective, parts of the country from the current grid perspective, where the sorts of characteristics that concentrated solar might have can be of immense value and therefore be much more competitive with other forms of technology. I don't think the question mentioned things like bioenergy, for example. Other parts of the world have done a lot more than we have to take advantage of their bioenergy resources and help that contribute. So I think it's all of the above. And I think as the Prime Minister said, I don't think we should be choosing technology winners. I think we need a market framework and mechanisms to support each of these different technologies through the different phases that they're up to, and let the market determine which of them ultimately will play a big role in the future of the energy system, or indeed which ones will play a niche role in the system in years to come.
A really, really good question here, or maybe a statement, that many of are of the opinion that lowering emissions from electricity can't be decoupled from increased energy prices. What do you reckon?
Well, again, I think that used to be the case. Yeah. I think, ultimately, as I said in my presentation, we're going to need new forms of power generation in years to come. Even if we ignore our emissions, the reality is, as a nation, you'd think there's a certain logic to choosing the form of power generation that has the lowest cost. And it just so happens that the form of power generation at the lowest cost has zero emissions. And so I think the reality is, we can deliver new forms of power generation and actually deliver on our emissions abatement target at the same point in time. And that's actually a lower cost outcome than any alternative. Yeah.
That's probably a nice connection then to some of the earlier questions around the retirement of fossil fuel generation. So without, assuming sort of worst case scenario, there's zero policy signal or pricing signal or market to drive new investment in renewables, what would that do to the timelines associated with, say, just the natural attrition of coal-fired generators coming in, being replaced by the lowest form of generation, which might be variable renewables plus some firming? What would that do timeline-wise, and then when you're thinking about Paris commitments and other things like that?
I mean, it's really hard to anticipate exactly how much coal generation will come out of the system at what moment in time. Obviously, Some of those generators have made commitments, some of those power stations there's a fair bit of disclosure about. But I mean, ultimately, most of them are now owned by private investors. They'll make decisions that suit their own commercial position. The chart I showed earlier just showed sort of the 50-year time horizon and when they may close. We know there's barriers to exit for some of them to close. There's pretty big remediation costs that hover there. I think the reality is that without some policy certainty, we know that the fundamentals are positive and strong for renewable energy. If you are building a new power station, renewable power stations are the lowest cost. But the reality is we're competing against incumbent generation that, in fact, the vast majority of it was built by taxpayers, depreciated, in some cases still owned by taxpayers. So it's not a level playing field. We're not talking about new build renewables versus new build gas or coal. We're competing against incumbent coal, and therefore that policy certainty is important. And we don't know exactly when that old generation is going to close down, but we know it's inevitable. And if we're not making the investment in new generation, we're going to see things like have been occurring in Victoria, where a large amount of generation exits the market at very short notice. I think it's fair to say we haven't invested in enough new generation, and wholesale power prices respond pretty quickly. And on one level, that's the way the market's designed. But on another level, if we'd have been more steadily investing in new generation, then we probably could have expected a more steady, stable response from the market. And I think that's what we're looking for from policy settings into the future. Yeah.
In the last minute and a half, this intersection, or this interface between state and federal energy policy, because obviously in the absence of bipartisan support at a federal level, we've seen the proliferation of different programs and approaches across the states. How do we marry those things up, or make them right, or unpick them, or whatever? How do you guys see that playing out in the medium term?
Yeah, look, I think it's fair to say industry's preference is always for single, strong national policy. I don't think there's any secret to that. The reality is we haven't had that, and that's not a partisan comment. We haven't had that over much of the past decade. And it's not surprising, therefore, that state governments have stepped more actively into the energy sector. I think whether they like it or not, they're being held to account for what happens in their state's energy system, be that from an energy security perspective or indeed an electricity price perspective. So, I think the reality is as an industry, we need to get used to that. I think there is a role for states and territories to play. It's been a very important one. If you look at what the ACT government have done with their reverse auction scheme over many years, if you look at what governments like South Australia and now Victoria and Queensland are doing to help fill the gaps, to help, look for those niches, to help identify and address some of the peculiar energy issues within their jurisdictions, then it's a really important role. But I don't think it's a substitute for that single, strong national policy, and let's hope in weeks and months ahead we get that, and then I think the states will continue to reflect on what their role is, where they need to play a role from a policy perspective, where they need to play a role from a regulatory perspective, and indeed a whole range of other areas, planning policy, electrical safety standards, a whole range of areas that states and territories fundamentally will continue to play a role.
Great. Kane, thank you so much. Everyone join me in thanking Kane Thornton.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, Kane. Cheers.